Merck invented this product to stop bleeding. In the end, it made complete strangers cry and hug each other. Hey guys, tonight we're talking about the most misunderstood molecule in the history of modern medicine, a substance that was invented by accident, ignored for 60 years, used to heal trauma, hijacked by nightclub culture, banned by governments, defended by scientists, and is still fighting for its existence right now in 2024. A drug that made hardened war veterans cry and talk about their feelings for the first time in decades. A drug that filled warehouses with 20,000 sweating, dancing strangers who all somehow felt like family. A drug that a researcher accidentally gave to monkeys, the wrong drug as it turned out, and nearly destroyed an entire field of science with one mislabeled bottle. MDMA has lived more lives than almost any other substance on Earth, and every single one of those lives ended in some kind of explosion. Here's the first thing that should make you stop. The people who invented it had absolutely no idea what they had made. None. They weren't trying to create emotional breakthroughs or revolutionize psychiatry. They were trying to stop bleeding. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. The year is 1912. Germany is the undisputed centre of the global pharmaceutical industry, and the company called Merck, not the American version that exists today, but its older, smaller German ancestor, is locked in a quiet arms race with every other lab on the continent. The goal is simple and enormously profitable. Find new compounds that can control bleeding in the human body. Whoever patents the right molecule wins a contract with every hospital and military surgeon in Europe. The pressure is real, the money is real, the stakes feel enormous, though they are about to become completely irrelevant. A chemist named Anton Kurlish is assigned the problem. He's 26 years old, trained, diligent, and almost certainly not someone who expected to leave a mark on the 20th century. His specific task is to synthesize a compound that could serve as an alternative to hydrastinine, a known blood-clotting agent that a rival company, Bayer, already held the patent on. Merck needed something that did the same job, worked differently, and could be owned. Kurlish got to work. What he produced was methylene-deoxymethamphetamine, MDMA. The synthesis itself was not remarkable by the standards of the time. It was competent lab work, methodical, unremarkable. The compound was logged, documented, assigned a patent number on December 24, 1912, Christmas Eve, and filed away as a potential intermediate chemical, something that might be useful later in the production of something else. Nobody tested it for psychoactive properties. Nobody injected it into animals. Nobody tried it on themselves. It was a stepping stone to a blood-clotting drug that was itself never actually developed. The whole project quietly died. Kurlish received no fame, no prize, no extraordinary recognition. He died in 1916 during World War I, 4 years after his most significant discovery, without ever knowing what he had made. The molecule that would one day be described by millions of people as the closest thing to unconditional love in chemical form was sitting in a Merck archive, categorized and forgotten for 60 years. This is where the story should end, if the world were logical. Patents expire. Compounds get lost. Science moves on. It didn't move on. In the 1950s, the United States Army began its own program of experimental chemical research, a project whose full scope would only become clear decades later. Among hundreds of compounds tested on soldiers without their knowledge or consent was MDA, a close chemical relative of MDMA. The soldiers reported extraordinary feelings of openness and emotional intensity. The army noted this, deemed it militarily useless, and filed the results. Again, the door opened slightly. Again, it closed. To understand why MDMA would eventually become so significant, why it would outlast every attempt to bury it, you have to understand what it actually does inside the human brain, because the chemistry is the story. Most drugs work on one system. Alcohol sedates, cocaine stimulates, opioids kill pain. MDMA does something structurally different. It triggers a simultaneous massive release of 3 neurotransmitters at once: serotonin, dopamine, and oxytocin, in quantities the brain almost never produces naturally at the same time. Serotonin governs mood, emotional processing, and the sense that things are fundamentally okay. Dopamine drives motivation and pleasure. Oxytocin, sometimes called the bonding hormone, is the chemical released between mothers and newborns, between people in love, between strangers who suddenly trust each other completely. The combination is not additive. It is something closer to multiplicative. The result is a state in which fear responses drop to nearly zero, emotional walls dissolve, and the person experiencing it feels simultaneously safe, connected, and completely present. Not euphoric in the chaotic, scattered way of cocaine, not numb in the drifting way of opioids, present, clear, open. There is nothing else in pharmacology that produces this exact profile. That specificity, that precise, almost surgical combination, is why MDMA would eventually make therapists weep with possibility, and governments tremble with fear. It is a molecule that does not belong neatly in any category, and yet in 1912 all of that was invisible. The compound sat in a filing cabinet while the world went through 2 world wars, the invention of antibiotics, the nuclear age, the birth of modern psychiatry, the rise of tranquilizers, and the entire first wave of the pharmaceutical revolution, without anyone so much as glancing at what Kullish had made on Christmas Eve. 60 years of silence. The silence would not last much longer. In California, a man was already growing up who would one day read about MDMA in an obscure chemical reference, walk into his backyard laboratory and synthesize it himself. He would try it. And the moment he did, he would understand instantly that Anton Kullish had made something that was never meant to stop bleeding at all. It was meant to open people up. Alexander Shulgin was not supposed to be the person who changed the history of psychedelic medicine. He had a PhD in biochemistry from UC Berkeley, a comfortable job at Dow Chemical, and a legitimate productive career ahead of him. He was brilliant in the conventional sense, the kind of person institutions are designed to produce and reward. Then, in 1961, he tried mescaline for the first time, and something in his understanding of what chemistry could do shifted permanently. Not because the experience was pleasurable, because it was precise. A specific molecule had produced a specific reproducible alteration in human consciousness, and to Shulgin that was not a recreational observation, it was a scientific one, the most interesting one he had ever encountered. He left Dow. He built a laboratory in the backyard of his home in Lafayette, California, a wooden shed crammed with glassware, burners, scales, and notebooks, and he began the most unusual private research program in the history of American pharmacology. His method was straightforward and almost insane by any modern standard. Synthesize a new compound, calculate a dose, take it himself, document everything, then do it again with something slightly different. Over the course of his career, Shulgin personally synthesized, tested, and documented over 200 psychoactive compounds. He was, in effect, a one-man drug discovery program operating out of a garden shed in the East Bay Hills. What made this possible, and what gives the story its first real twist, was the DEA. In a decision that would later seem almost incomprehensible, the Drug Enforcement Administration granted Shulgin a Schedule I research license in the 1970s. This meant he could legally synthesize and possess controlled substances for research purposes. He was, officially, one of the very few private citizens in America with government permission to work with the most restricted class of drugs in existence. The DEA trusted him. He was a known quantity, a legitimate scientist, a former corporate chemist with no criminal record. They would spend the next 2 decades regretting that decision enormously. Shulgin first encountered MDMA not through any dramatic revelation, but through the dry, methodical process of combing chemical literature. The compound appeared in references, that 1912 Merck patent, some peripheral army research, as something that existed but had never been seriously studied for psychoactive effects. In 1976 he synthesized it. He refined the process, established what he believed to be a reasonable dose, and tried it. What happened next is documented in his own meticulous notes, later published in his landmark book, Pirkal, Phenethylamines I Have Known and Loved. The experience was unlike anything else in his catalogue. There were no hallucinations, no distortion of reality, no loss of control. Instead, there was what he described as a state of extraordinary emotional clarity, a feeling of being completely present, completely unafraid, and completely open to whatever was true. Not high, not sedated, just, as he wrote, profoundly and unusually well. He understood immediately that this was different. Most of the compounds in his library were interesting as scientific curiosities or as tools for exploring the further edges of consciousness. MDMA was something with immediate, practical human application. The fear response, the wall that most people carry constantly, the one that makes honest conversation so difficult and emotional healing so slow. It was simply gone, not suppressed, not numbed, dissolved cleanly without taking anything else with it. Shulgin was not a therapist, but he knew one. Leo Zeff was 65 years old in 1977, a Jungian psychotherapist based in Oakland with decades of experience using psychedelic compounds, primarily LSD and MDA, as therapeutic aids. He had quietly worked this way for years, operating at the far edges of what was legally and professionally permissible, convinced that these substances could accelerate therapeutic breakthroughs that would otherwise take years. By 1977, he was considering retirement. His body was slowing. He had done what he could. Then Shulgin called him. The effect MDMA had on Zeff was immediate and total. He tried it, experienced the same dissolution of the fear response that Shulgin had described, and made a decision that same week. He was not retiring. He was starting over. Zeff became MDMA's first true missionary, travelling across the United States and later to Europe, training therapists one by one in what he called the new technique. He gave the drug a name in these sessions, Adam. The name was chosen deliberately, meant to evoke the state of a person before shame, before the accumulated damage of a life, before all the walls went up, a return to original openness. Over the next 7 years, Zeff trained an estimated 4,000 therapists. He didn't advertise, he didn't publish papers or hold conferences. He worked through personal networks, through trust, through word of mouth so quiet it barely registered as sound. Each therapist he trained went on to use the technique with their own patients, carefully, privately, with genuine clinical intention. The number of people who received MDMA-assisted therapy in this period has never been precisely established, but estimates range from 300,000 to 500,000 Americans, all of it legal, all of it undocumented in any official record. A therapeutic revolution conducted entirely in whispers. The compound that was doing this work had a specific, almost paradoxical quality that made it ideal for trauma treatment and nearly impossible to abuse in the way other drugs were abused. MDMA produced no craving during the experience itself. Patients didn't want more while they were on it. because the experience was complete in itself. It lasted 3 to 5 hours and ended cleanly, without the brutal crash of stimulants or the extended twilight of psychedelics. Patients emerged from sessions feeling not depleted but clarified, as though something that had been tangled had been straightened out. Veterans with combat trauma spoke about things they had carried for years in complete silence. Women who had survived sexual abuse found, often for the first time, that they could describe what had happened to them without re-entering the terror of the original experience. Couples in crisis discovered that there was still something real between them, underneath all the accumulated resentment. The therapists using MDMA were not reporting incremental improvements. They were reporting transformations. Shulgin watched all of this from his backyard laboratory, continuing to synthesize, continuing to document, continuing to correspond with researchers and clinicians who were beginning to understand that something genuinely significant was happening. He published, he lectured, he was open about his work in a way that was either spectacularly brave or spectacularly reckless, depending on your perspective. He also kept synthesizing new compounds, hundreds of them, cataloguing every one with the same obsessive precision. His notebooks from this period describe MDMA consistently as among the most significant molecules he had ever encountered. Not the most dramatic, not the most extreme, the most useful, the most human. The backyard laboratory in Lafayette was producing year by year what was becoming the most important suppressed research program in American medical history. And the DEA, which had given Shulgin his license and essentially funded his credibility, had no idea what was growing in that garden shed, or what was already spreading far beyond it. There is a version of MDMA's history that almost nobody knows, because it happened in silence, in private offices, in rooms with closed doors and no cameras, no music, no crowds, no fluorescent lights or bass drops. Just a patient on a couch, a therapist nearby, and a molecule doing something that decades of conventional treatment had failed to do. This version of the story lasted approximately 7 years, and by any honest measure, it produced results that should have changed psychiatry forever. The therapists who worked with MDMA during this period were not fringe experimenters or countercultural holdovers from the 60s. Many of them were established clinicians, psychiatrists, psychologists, licensed counselors with decades of practice, who had tried every conventional tool available and understood precisely what those tools could and could not do. Talk therapy was slow. Antidepressants blunted effect without resolving the underlying architecture of trauma. Exposure therapy worked for some patients and re-traumatized others. The gap between what psychiatry promised and what it consistently delivered was enormous, and every serious clinician knew it. When word of MDMA reached them through Zeph's network, they didn't embrace it out of desperation or naivety. They embraced it because the evidence in front of them was impossible to dismiss. The clinical protocol that emerged during these years was careful and consistent. Patients were screened extensively beforehand. Not everyone was considered suitable, and conditions like active psychosis or serious cardiovascular problems were clear disqualifiers. The session itself typically lasted 5 to 6 hours, conducted in a comfortable, quiet room designed to feel safe rather than clinical. The dose was moderate, carefully measured. A therapist remained present throughout, not directing the experience but available, grounding, witnessing. The patient was encouraged to go inward, to follow whatever emerged, to allow the drug's specific quality of fearless openness to take them somewhere they had previously been unable to go. What happened in those rooms defied easy clinical categorization. A combat veteran who had not slept a full night in 11 years without waking in a cold sweat would spend 3 hours gently, almost methodically, revisiting the events he had never been able to speak about, and emerged from the session not traumatized but relieved, not cured in some miraculous instant, but substantively, measurably changed. The terror that had been locked around the memory had loosened. The memory was still there. The stranglehold was not. The mechanism behind this was not mystical. It was neurological. MDMA's suppression of the fear response, specifically its effect on the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, allowed patients to access traumatic material without triggering the full physiological cascade of re-traumatization. They could look at the worst thing that had ever happened to them from a slight merciful distance, close enough to see it clearly, far enough not to be destroyed by it again. Therapists had been searching for exactly this quality, the ability to approach trauma without being consumed by it, for as long as trauma therapy had existed. Women who had survived sexual violence found the same door opening. The experience of assault carries a specific, layered kind of damage. Shame layered over fear, layered over grief, layered over a body that no longer feels entirely safe to inhabit. Conventional therapy could address these layers one at a time, slowly, painfully, across years of sessions. MDMA seemed to dissolve several of them simultaneously, not by erasing the experience but by separating the factual memory from the overwhelming emotional charge attached to it. Patients described feeling, often for the first time, that what had happened to them was something that had been done to them, external, finished, not a permanent definition of who they were. Couples therapy produced results that were equally striking and considerably harder to explain within any standard clinical framework. Relationships in serious distress, years of accumulated resentment, failed communication, emotional distance that had hardened into something like contempt, would shift dramatically in a single MDMA session. Not because the drug manufactured false warmth or chemically induced forgiveness, but because oxytocin levels high enough to approximate the neurochemical state of early romantic love, combined with the complete absence of defensive fear, allowed two people to remember simultaneously why they had chosen each other in the first place. The resentment didn't disappear. The foundation it had been built on became visible again. The name Adam, Zeph's name for the drug, was quietly replaced in many clinical circles by the more straightforward MDMA, though the connotation lingered. The idea of a return to a state before shame, before armor, before the self-protective distortions that accumulate over a lifetime. This was not mere poetic language. Therapists were watching it happen in real time, session after session, with a consistency that bordered on the reproducible. What is crucial to understand about this entire period is what it was not. It was not recreational. It was not casual. There were no clubs, no DJs, no glow sticks, no strangers packed into warehouses. The people using MDMA during these years were taking it once, twice at most, in carefully controlled conditions for specific therapeutic purposes. The drug was not being abused. Nobody was becoming addicted. MDMA's neurochemical profile made compulsive daily use essentially self-defeating, since repeated frequent dosing rapidly depleted the serotonin reserves it depended on, producing diminishing returns. The therapeutic model was inherently self-limiting in a way that made it structurally unlike any other drug category. By 1984, the community of therapists using MDMA had grown large enough to be visible, though it was still operating entirely through private networks. Research papers were beginning to appear, careful, measured, written in the restrained language of clinical science, which made their findings no less extraordinary. There was serious discussion about whether to pursue formal FDA approval to bring the therapy into the open, to conduct the kind of large-scale trials that could make MDMA-assisted treatment available to the millions of people who needed it. The possibility felt real. The momentum felt genuine. Nobody in that community anticipated what was already happening 1,500 miles away in Texas, in a world that could not have been more different from their quiet, carpeted therapy rooms. Someone had taken Adam out of the clinic. They had renamed it. They were selling it over the bar in Dallas nightclubs for $20 a hit, and the crowds were growing every single weekend, and it was already far, far too late to put it back. The exact moment MDMA escaped the clinical world has never been precisely identified, because leaks rarely have a single source. They seep. They find cracks in the container and flow through them quietly, and by the time anyone notices the floor is wet, the damage is already done. What is known is that by 1983, the drug that Leo Zeff's network had been using so carefully, so quietly, so deliberately, was no longer contained within that network. It had reached Texas, and Texas, in 1983, was not a therapy room. The man most often credited, or blamed, depending on your perspective, with taking MDMA recreational is a distributor named Michael Clegg. He was not a chemist, not a therapist, not a researcher. He was an entrepreneur who understood markets, and what he saw in MDMA was a product with extraordinary demand potential and zero competition. The drug was completely legal. Anyone could synthesize it, possess it, sell it. There were no laws against it because nobody in law enforcement had thought to write any yet. Clegg recognized this window with the clarity of someone who understood that windows close. The branding decision alone tells you everything about the shift in context. The therapeutic community called the drug Adam, a name pointing inward, toward innocence and self-examination. Clegg reportedly considered calling it empathy, which was arguably the most accurate single-word description of its effects. He rejected it. Empathy didn't sell. Instead, he chose ecstasy, a word pointing outward, toward peak experience, toward pleasure, toward something you pursued rather than something that found you. The rename was not cosmetic. It was a complete repositioning of the product, its purpose, and its intended user. In changing the name, Clegg changed the drug's entire cultural meaning before most people had even heard of it. Dallas and Fort Worth in 1983 were cities in the middle of an oil boom nightlife explosion. Money was moving, clubs were opening, and the appetite for new experiences among young, affluent Texans was essentially unlimited. Ecstasy appeared in this environment like a match dropped into dry grass. It was sold openly over club bars, not in back alleys, not through whispered transactions in bathroom stalls, but literally across the counter, next to the bourbon and the beer, by bartenders who treated it as an upmarket product for upmarket customers. The price point reinforced this positioning. $20 a tablet was expensive by any standard, which made it aspirational rather than desperate. The effects in a nightclub environment were immediately and obviously different from the effects in a therapy room. The same neurochemical cascade, the serotonin flood, the oxytocin surge, the dissolution of fear and social inhibition, produced something entirely different when it was happening in a room full of music and moving bodies and strangers, rather than on a quiet couch with a trained therapist. The empathy didn't disappear. It expanded outward instead of inward. Instead of connecting a patient to their own buried emotional truth, it connected them to every person in the room simultaneously. The music felt physical, personal, urgent. Strangers became instantly, inexplicably dear. The night felt like it contained something important that had never been available before. Word moved at the speed that only truly pleasurable things move. Within months, ecstasy had spread from the Dallas club scene to Houston, Austin, and San Antonio. By 1984, it was moving through New York, Miami, Los Angeles, and Chicago, not yet in massive quantities, but consistently, reliably, and with the kind of enthusiastic word-of-mouth marketing that no advertising budget could buy. Every person who tried it told 3 others. Every person those 3 told 3 more. The math was simple, and the trajectory was vertical. The supply chain that emerged was as unusual as everything else about this period. Because MDMA remained entirely legal, it could be manufactured openly, transported openly, and sold openly. Several small chemical companies began producing it in bulk. It was not particularly difficult to synthesize for anyone with basic chemistry training. The infrastructure of the illegal drug trade, the violence, the territorial disputes, the corrupted supply chains, the cutting with dangerous adulterants, was almost entirely absent. This was a legal product moving through something that resembled, in its early phase, an actual legitimate market. The therapeutic community learned what was happening through the same word-of-mouth networks that had built their own practice, and the reaction was something close to horror. Not because they were naive about pleasure or moralistic about recreational drug use. Many of them had come of age in the 60s and harboured no particular puritanism. The horror was specific and professional. They had spent years establishing careful protocols precisely because they understood that MDMA's power was not neutral. A molecule that dissolved emotional walls with that kind of efficiency needed to be used in a context where what was revealed could be safely processed, held, integrated. A nightclub was not that context. What nobody in the therapeutic community fully grasped yet was how quickly the legal status was about to change. The Texas club scene had been generating local news coverage since late 1983. By 1984, national media had picked up the story, not in the measured analytical way of scientific journalism, but in the breathless, alarmed register of a moral panic building up steam. Headlines called Ecstasy the yuppie drug. Television segments showed young people dancing in clubs with dilated pupils and expressions of transparent joy, which television somehow made look more threatening than footage of people unconscious in gutters. The framing was already set before the facts were fully established. The DEA was not watching television for its intelligence, but it was watching. Field offices in Texas had been filing reports since early 1984. The pattern was clear: a psychoactive substance structurally related to amphetamine being sold commercially in nightclubs to large numbers of people, generating enormous profit for its distributors and attracting significant media attention. Every one of those factors, in DEA institutional logic, pointed toward the same response. The therapeutic community, realizing for the first time that their quiet revolution was about to be caught in a crossfire it had nothing to do with, scrambled to organize. Researchers began drafting formal responses. Clinicians prepared to testify. The argument they intended to make was careful, evidence-based, and entirely reasonable. This substance in clinical hands was producing results that no existing treatment could match, and scheduling it as a dangerous drug with no medical value would be a catastrophic error. They were already preparing those arguments when the DEA made its first move, and what happened next would reveal just how little space there was in American drug policy for evidence-based reasoning, when the cameras were already rolling and the headlines were already written. The Drug Enforcement Administration did not move slowly when it decided to act. In July 1984, the agency began formal proceedings to place MDMA on Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act, the most restrictive classification in American drug law, reserved for substances deemed to have no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. Schedule 1 meant no prescriptions, no clinical use, no research without extraordinarily difficult-to-obtain federal licenses. It meant, in practical terms, that the drug would cease to exist legally in any form. The DEA's justification was straightforward. MDMA was structurally related to MDA, which was already Schedule 1. It was being sold recreationally in nightclubs, and the media coverage was making institutional inaction politically impossible. What the DEA did not anticipate was the organised, articulate, scientifically credentialed resistance that emerged almost immediately in response. Researchers, psychiatrists, psychopharmacologists, and therapists who had spent years working carefully with MDMA filed formal objections to the scheduling proposal in numbers that surprised even the DEA's own administrators. This was not a protest movement of activists waving signs. It was a mobilization of credentialed professionals submitting peer-reviewed evidence, clinical case documentation, and formal legal challenges through exactly the procedural mechanisms the law provided. They demanded hearings. They got them. The administrative law hearings that followed were among the most unusual proceedings in the history of American drug regulation. For months through 1985 and into 1986, witnesses testified before DEA Administrative Law Judge Francis Young, a meticulous, serious jurist with no particular ideological stake in the outcome. Psychiatrists described cases in detail. Researchers presented data. Patients who had undergone MDMA-assisted therapy testified about what the treatment had done for them in terms that were impossible to dismiss as anecdotal enthusiasm. The record that accumulated across those hearings was substantial, specific, and entirely contrary to the DEA's characterization of MDMA as a substance with no medical value. Judge Young listened to all of it. Then he ruled. His recommendation, issued in 1986, was that MDMA should be placed not on Schedule 1 but on Schedule 3, a classification that would restrict recreational use while preserving the ability of licensed medical professionals to use it therapeutically. His reasoning was explicit. The evidence presented demonstrated that MDMA had accepted medical use in treatment in the United States, that it had a relatively low potential for abuse compared to other scheduled substances, and that placing it on Schedule 1 would constitute an overreach that the evidence did not support. It was, by the standards of administrative law, a careful and defensible ruling. The DEA administrator rejected it entirely. John Lawn, the DEA administrator at the time, exercised his legal authority to override his own agency's administrative law judge and placed MDMA on Schedule 1 on an emergency basis in 1985, before the hearings had even concluded. The emergency scheduling provision, designed for situations requiring immediate public safety intervention, had never previously been used against a substance with an active clinical research community publicly defending its medical utility. It was a precedent, and not a comfortable one. The message it sent was precise. The scientific record could be heard, documented, and then disregarded. The institutional decision had already been made before the first witness took the stand. The research community challenged the emergency ruling in court. They won, technically. A federal appeals court ruled in 1987 that the emergency scheduling had been procedurally improper and ordered the DEA to reconsider. There was a brief, strange period in which MDMA was technically legal again, while the agency completed its review. The therapeutic community felt a flicker of genuine hope. That flicker lasted approximately 18 months. In March 1988, the DEA made MDMA's Schedule 1 status permanent. This time the procedural paperwork was correct. The scientific objections were noted, acknowledged, and overruled. The clinical evidence was characterized as insufficient for the purposes of scheduling determination. MDMA joined heroin, LSD, and psilocybin in the category of substances officially declared to have no medical value whatsoever, a category that the researchers who had just spent 3 years presenting evidence to the contrary found somewhere between infuriating and absurd. The consequences of this decision radiated outward in multiple directions simultaneously. For the therapeutic community, it meant that the careful, documented, clinically supervised work of the previous decade was now criminal. Therapists who continued to use MDMA risked their licenses, their practices, and their freedom. Most stopped. The knowledge they had accumulated, the protocols, the observations, the clinical wisdom built through thousands of sessions, went underground with the drug itself, preserved in personal notes and private correspondence rather than published research. For Alexander Shulgin, the scheduling created an immediate and specific problem. His DEA license technically still permitted him to work with Schedule I substances for research purposes, but the political environment had shifted dramatically. The agency that had once regarded him as a useful collaborator now viewed him with something considerably colder. He continued working in his Lafayette laboratory, but the window of official tolerance was visibly narrowing. What nobody in Washington had modelled in their scheduling calculus was the effect of prohibition on distribution. When MDMA was legal, it was manufactured by small legitimate chemical operations, sold at known doses through consistent channels, and used by people who understood roughly what they were taking. The moment it became Schedule I, all of that infrastructure evaporated and was replaced by something far less controllable. The market didn't disappear, it went dark. And in the darkness, the supply chain began to change in ways that would eventually kill people. The DEA had set out to eliminate a drug. What it had actually done was remove every quality control mechanism that had made that drug relatively safe, drive its production into criminal networks, strip away the clinical context that had given its use meaning, and guarantee that it would be used by vastly more people in vastly less controlled circumstances than it had ever been before. The scheduling of MDMA did not end the MDMA story. It detonated it. Across the Atlantic, a group of British tourists was about to land in Ibiza for a summer holiday. They would find the drug waiting for them there, cheaper, more abundant, and embedded in a music culture so perfectly matched to its effects that the combination would ignite something neither the DEA nor the therapeutic community had imagined possible. What came next would make the Texas club scene look like a dress rehearsal. Ibiza in 1987 was already a strange place, a small Spanish island that had been drawing artists, hippies, and European pleasure seekers since the 1960s, operating on a kind of permanent exemption from ordinary social rules. The clubs there ran until dawn as a matter of policy. The music was different from anything on the British mainland, a hybrid of American house music filtering up from Chicago and Detroit, layered over Balearic rhythms that seemed designed specifically to dissolve the boundary between a person's body and the air around it. American DJs and expats had brought MDMA to the island sometime in the mid-1980s, where it had quietly embedded itself into the club scene without attracting serious attention. Then, in the summer of 1987, a specific group of British DJs arrived. 4 men, Danny Rampling, Paul Oakenfold, Nicky Holloway, and Johnny Walker, flew to Ibiza for a holiday. They were already working DJs with established careers in London's club scene, but what they encountered on the island was categorically different from anything they had experienced before. The combination of MDMA and house music in the open-air clubs of Ibiza produced something they could not easily describe afterward, a collective physical and emotional experience that made ordinary club culture seem flat and mechanical by comparison. They watched crowds of strangers move in a kind of synchronized abandon that looked less like dancing and more like a shared neurological event. They brought it home. Within months of returning to London, each of them had begun hosting new nights built explicitly around the Ibiza template, house music, specific lighting, and a crowd that was, increasingly, sharing the same chemical experience. Danny Rampling opened Shoom in a small South London gym in January 1988. The capacity was barely 300 people, The waiting list within weeks was thousands. Oakenfold's nights at the Spectrum Club in Charing Cross became legendary, with a speed that confused even the people organising them. Something was happening in London that had no precedent in British nightlife history, and it was spreading faster than anyone could track. The drug supply in Britain during this period arrived primarily through networks connected to the Ibiza scene. Small quantities at first, expensive, inconsistent. But demand that grows at the rate London's was growing in 1988 creates its own supply infrastructure almost automatically. By mid-1988, MDMA was moving through British cities in quantities that dwarfed anything seen before, and the price was dropping as production scaled up. More importantly, it was leaving the clubs and heading outdoors. The orbital motorway system around London, the M25, became the logistical spine of something that had no official name yet. Promoters began organising events in fields, warehouses, and aircraft hangars outside the city, accessible by car, announced through phone trees and flyers distributed at clubs the night before. The locations were secret until hours before the event started. There were no licenses, no capacity limits, no safety regulations, no bar serving watered-down drinks at inflated prices. There was a sound system, a field, and sometimes 10,000 people, sometimes 20,000, arriving in convoys that stretched back miles along the motorway. This was the second summer of love, 1988, named deliberately after 1967, and it transformed British culture in ways that are still visible today. The music was electronic, hypnotic, structurally unlike anything in the rock or pop tradition. No verse-chorus structure, no lyrics in the conventional sense, no single performer commanding attention from a stage. It was designed to be collective, continuous, and physical. MDMA was not incidental to this design. The music and the drug had found each other with the precision of two puzzle pieces manufactured separately and assembled by accident, and the fit was so exact that it was almost impossible afterward to discuss one without the other. Manchester absorbed the energy from London and transformed it into something distinctly its own. The Hacienda, a club that had been losing money for years, subsidised by factory records and the earnings of New Order, suddenly became the most important nightclub in Britain. Tony Wilson, Factory's founder, later described watching the Hacienda transform in 1988 and 1989 with a mixture of exhilaration and bewilderment. The crowds that had previously been sparse and self-consciously cool were now enormous, physical, ecstatic, and entirely indifferent to the traditional social hierarchies of the music industry. Everyone was dancing. Everyone was, in the particular way that MDMA made possible, genuinely happy to be there. The Manchester scene that emerged, the loose cultural movement centred on the Hacienda, the bands that grew from it, the specific aesthetic of baggy clothes and euphoric guitar-laced house music, was a direct product of the drug's social effects. MDMA collapsed the distance between people. It made the reserved, ironically detached posture of British indie culture feel not just unnecessary but actively absurd. Bands like the Happy Mondays, who were embedded in the drug culture from the beginning, became internationally successful, partly because their music carried the specific emotional register of a generation that had spent its weekends in a state of chemically assisted collective openness. The expansion beyond Britain was rapid and followed predictable paths. European cities with established club cultures, Berlin, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Barcelona, absorbed the combination of MDMA and electronic music through the same tourist and expat networks that had seeded Britain from Ibiza. Berlin's specific political context. The wall fell in November 1989. releasing an enormous surge of social energy into a city with dozens of abandoned buildings perfect for illegal events, accelerated the process dramatically. Techno-found MDMA found Berlin found the entire former Eastern Bloc, and what emerged was a club culture of such scale and intensity that the German government would spend the next decade trying to understand what had happened to its youth. Back in the United States, the same transformation was arriving through different channels. The warehouse rave scene that emerged in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago, and New York in the early 1990s drew directly from the British model. The same electronic music, the same outdoor and warehouse events, the same culture of flyers and phone trees and last-minute location announcements. MDMA was present from the beginning, though the American drug supply was already more adulterated than the British equivalent, a problem that would worsen dramatically as the decade progressed. The DEA observed all of this with the particular frustration of an institution that had done exactly what it was supposed to do and achieved the opposite of its intended result. Scheduling MDMA in 1985 had not reduced its use. It had removed quality control, criminalized the supply chain, exported the culture to every English-speaking country simultaneously, and attached the drug permanently to one of the most durable and globally influential music movements of the 20th century. The molecule that had been filed away in a Merck cabinet in 1912, rediscovered by a backyard chemist, and used quietly in therapy rooms for 7 years, was now inside the bodies of hundreds of thousands of young people every weekend across 3 continents, and then people started dying. The deaths were real. That has to be stated clearly without qualification, because what happened afterward, the distortion, the manipulation, the selective amplification of certain facts and burial of others, can only be understood against the backdrop of genuine tragedy. Young people did die. Families were destroyed. The grief was not manufactured. What was manufactured was the explanation, and the explanation was used to justify something far larger than public safety. The first wave of ecstasy-related deaths in Britain came primarily from 2 causes, and they were almost entirely opposite problems. Some users died from hypothermia, overheating. MDMA raises body temperature, suppresses the sensation of exhaustion, and produces the compulsive desire to keep dancing. In poorly ventilated venues with no access to water or cool air, sustained dancing for hours could push core body temperature to fatal levels. The early illegal rave scene had almost no safety infrastructure, no medics, no water stations, no crowd management, no way for someone in distress to get help before they collapsed. The drug was not solely responsible for these deaths. The environment was equally culpable, but the environment was harder to photograph. Then came the second cause, and it was the precise opposite: hyponatremia, water intoxication. MDMA causes the body to retain water by triggering the release of antidiuretic hormone, and when users, correctly warned that they needed to stay hydrated, drank large quantities of water while dancing, the combination could dilute sodium levels in the blood to dangerous and ultimately fatal concentrations. The brain swells, seizures follow, death can occur within hours. The cruel irony was that people were dying partly because they had listened to harm reduction advice that was incomplete. Stay hydrated was the message. The missing half of that message was don't overhydrate. Roughly 500 milliliters per hour while dancing, no more. Neither of these causes was secret information. Harm reduction organizations had been distributing accurate guidance since the early 1990s. Doctors who treated rave casualties understood the mechanisms clearly. The information existed. It simply never travelled as fast or as far as the headlines. Leah Betts died on November 16, 1995. She was 18 years old, celebrating her birthday at home in Essex with friends. She took a single ecstasy tablet, one not several, and over the following hours drank approximately 7 litres of water. She collapsed into a coma, was placed on life support, and died 5 days later. Her parents, in an act of extraordinary and devastating courage, released her medical photographs to the media, specifically the image of Leah on life support, tubes and monitors surrounding her, her face swollen almost beyond recognition from the fluid accumulating in her brain. The image went everywhere. It appeared on billboards across Britain under the words "sorted." Just one ecstasy tablet took Leah Betts. It ran on front pages for weeks. It became the defining image of ecstasy's danger for an entire generation of British teenagers and their parents. Politicians cited it in parliamentary debates. Police used it in school assemblies. The image did what it was intended to do. It made the drug feel immediately personally lethal in a way that statistics never could. The problem was the caption. Leah Betts had not died from one ecstasy tablet. She had died from water intoxication, from hyponatremia caused by drinking 7 litres of water in a few hours, while the drug caused her body to retain fluid. The tablet was a contributing factor in the chain of events, but characterizing her death as caused by ecstasy alone was a medical misrepresentation, and the doctors who treated her said so publicly. Those corrections appeared in smaller fonts on inside pages of newspapers that had run the billboard image across their entire front cover. The gap between what happened to Leah Betts and what the public was told happened to Leah Betts is not a minor technical distinction. It is the difference between two entirely different public health responses. If the cause of death was the drug itself, the solution was zero tolerance and complete abstinence. If the cause was incomplete harm reduction information, combined with a drug that affects fluid regulation, the solution was better, more specific public education that could actually save lives. Britain chose zero tolerance. The deaths from hyponatremia and hypothermia continued. The moral panic that surrounded Leah Betts' death had been building for years before it peaked. British tabloids, The Sun, the Daily Mail, the Mirror, had been running ecstasy horror stories since the early 1990s, with a frequency and intensity that operated almost independently of actual casualty rates. Each death was covered exhaustively. The broader context, that hundreds of thousands of people used MDMA every weekend and the overwhelming majority did so without dying, was not considered newsworthy. The asymmetry was structural. Fear sells. Nuance does not. Politicians responded to the panic with the tools politicians have available: legislation, enforcement, and rhetoric. The Criminal Justice and Public Order Act of 1994 in Britain effectively criminalised outdoor raves by giving police the power to shut down any gathering of more than 100 people where amplified music was being played. The specific language of the Act, which defined the relevant music as that wholly or predominantly characterised by the repetitive beats, was so transparently targeted at rave culture that it became a cultural artifact in its own right. The repetitive beats clause was real. It was law. In the United States, the same years produced the same pattern with local variations. Club owners, terrified of liability, began banning harm reduction measures with a logic that managed to be both legally understandable and medically catastrophic. Water was banned at some venues, not because owners wanted people to die, but because the presence of water stations was considered legally admissible evidence that the venue management knew drug use was occurring. Glow sticks were banned. Pacifiers, used because MDMA causes jaw clenching, were banned. The result was that every harm reduction tool the rave community had developed through hard experience was systematically removed from the environments where it was most needed. Underneath the panic, underneath the legislation, underneath the tabloid headlines and the parliamentary speeches and the billboard campaigns using dead girls' faces, a quieter and more consequential process was underway. The drug supply was changing. The criminal networks that had replaced the quasi-legitimate distribution chains of the late 1980s were adulterating their product with increasing frequency and decreasing care. Pills sold as Ecstasy contained, in various combinations, MDMA, MDA, methamphetamine, ketamine, caffeine, and substances that had no business being inside anyone's body at all. The drug that had once been consistent enough to be used therapeutically at measured doses was now a lottery. And the people most exposed to that lottery were the youngest, the least experienced, and the least likely to know that what they were holding might have nothing to do with what they had asked for. The moral panic had done exactly what moral panics do. It had prevented an honest conversation about risk, harm reduction, and the actual pharmacology of the drug while doing nothing whatsoever to reduce its use. MDMA consumption in Britain continued rising through the mid-1990s despite everything. The deaths continued, the headlines continued, and in research laboratories, a different kind of damage was being measured. Damage that was about to give the anti-MDMA campaign its most powerful scientific weapon yet. Science has a reputation for being immune to politics. The reputation is undeserved. Science is conducted by human beings who operate inside institutions that depend on funding, reputation, and the approval of governments and grant committees. When the political environment around a particular substance is sufficiently hostile, the science produced about that substance tends to reflect the hostility, not always through deliberate fraud, but through the subtler mechanisms of which questions get asked, which results get published, and which findings get amplified into policy. The story of MDMA neurotoxicity research in the late 1990s and early 2000s is a masterclass in how this process works, and how catastrophically it can fail. The underlying science was not invented. Real concerns about MDMA's effects on serotonin neurons had existed since the late 1980s, when animal studies first suggested that high, repeated doses could damage the axon terminals of serotonin-producing neurons in rats and primates. The key qualifiers in those studies, high doses, repeated administration, significant gaps between the damage seen in animals and anything documented in humans, were noted carefully in the original research. What happened to those qualifiers as the findings travelled from academic journals into public discourse was not careful at all. By the late 1990s, a narrative had solidified in media coverage and political speech that was considerably more alarming than the actual scientific literature supported. The claim, stated with increasing confidence in newspaper articles and congressional testimony, was that recreational MDMA use caused permanent brain damage, not potential damage at extreme doses, not dose-dependent serotonin depletion that might or might not be permanent. Permanent brain damage, the kind that shows up in scans, the kind that produces cognitive deficits visible in neuropsychological testing, the kind that, once stated simply enough and repeated often enough, becomes very difficult to dislodge regardless of what the evidence actually shows. Into this environment, in September 2002, a researcher named George Ricourt published a study in the journal Science, one of the most prestigious scientific publications in the world. Ricourt was a neurologist at Johns Hopkins University with a long track record of MDMA research, most of it focused on neurotoxicity. His 2002 paper claimed something extraordinary, that a single moderate recreational dose of MDMA, the kind of dose a person might take at a single rave, could cause severe, potentially irreversible damage to dopamine neurons in primates, producing symptoms resembling early Parkinson's disease. Not serotonin neurons, which previous research had focused on. Dopamine neurons. The system involved in movement control, motivation, and the progression of one of the most feared neurological diseases in the world. The study landed like an explosion. Media coverage was immediate and global. Congressional representatives cited it in floor speeches. The DEA distributed summaries to law enforcement agencies nationwide. Anti-drug campaigns incorporated it into educational materials within weeks. Ricord himself testified before Congress, where the findings were treated not as preliminary research requiring replication, but as settled scientific fact justifying immediate and aggressive policy action. A single study, published in a prestigious journal, had apparently confirmed the worst fears about MDMA and placed the neuroscience community's credibility firmly behind the government's position. The study had one problem. The results were impossible to replicate. Other researchers attempting to reproduce Ricord's findings using the same doses his paper described kept getting different results. Results that looked nothing like the catastrophic dopaminergic damage his primates had shown. The discrepancy was too large to be explained by normal scientific variation. Something was wrong, but identifying what exactly required the kind of careful, methodical investigation that takes time during which Ricord's findings continued to circulate as established fact. The answer, when it came, was almost too absurd to believe. In September 2003, exactly 1 year after the original publication, Ricord retracted the paper. The explanation he provided to science was as stark as it was damning. His laboratory had made an error in the preparation of the drug solutions used in the experiment. The bottles had been mislabeled. The primates in his study had not been injected with MDMA. They had been injected with methamphetamine, a structurally related but pharmacologically distinct compound that is genuinely neurotoxic to dopamine neurons at high doses. The most influential anti-MDMA neurotoxicity study in history, the one cited in Congress and distributed by the DEA and incorporated into a generation of anti-drug education, had been conducted with the wrong drug. The retraction received a fraction of the coverage the original publication had generated. This ratio, enormous initial coverage of alarming findings, minimal coverage of their subsequent collapse, is not specific to drug research. It is a structural feature of how science journalism operates, and its consequences in this case were severe and lasting. The Ricord paper was gone from the scientific record, but its conclusions remained embedded in public perception, in policy documents, in the minds of lawmakers who'd been briefed on it and never briefed on its retraction. What made the affair genuinely complicated and genuinely troubling beyond the immediate embarrassment was the question of what the actual neurotoxicity evidence showed once the noise was removed. The honest answer was that it showed something, but considerably less dramatic than the Ricord version. High doses of MDMA, taken repeatedly over short periods, did produce measurable reductions in serotonin transporter density in human users, findings consistent with long-term heavy use damaging serotonergic axon terminals. Whether this damage was permanent, whether it produced meaningful cognitive deficits in the real world, and whether it occurred at the moderate doses used in clinical settings remained genuinely contested questions. The problem was that after Ricord, these nuances were almost impossible to discuss publicly without being heard through the distorting filter of the retraction scandal. Researchers who argued that MDMA carried real neurotoxicity risks were associated, fairly or not, with the culture of exaggeration the Ricord affair had exposed. Researchers who argued the risks had been overstated found themselves inadvertently providing rhetorical ammunition to people whose position on MDMA had nothing to do with neuroscience. The entire scientific conversation about MDMA's risks had been poisoned, not by the truth, not by lies exactly, but by a labelling error in a primate laboratory at Johns Hopkins that cascaded through a decade of drug policy, congressional testimony, media coverage, and public health education with consequences that nobody has ever fully measured. Somewhere in a federal archive, there are policy documents citing a study that does not exist. Somewhere in a school somewhere, a teacher may still be showing students a graphic from a retracted paper as evidence of what ecstasy does to the brain. The mislabeled bottle was thrown away in 2003. Its contents are still circulating. While George Recort's retracted study was still being cited in congressional hearings, while the DEA was still treating every MDMA-related development as a public safety emergency, and while the rave scene was absorbing body blow after legislative body blow, one man had been running a quiet parallel operation for nearly 2 decades. His name was Rick Doblin. He had founded a non-profit organization called MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. In 1986, the same year the DEA made MDMA's Schedule I status permanent. The timing was not coincidental. It was a direct response. Doblin was not a scientist by original training. He had a master's degree in public policy from Harvard's Kennedy School, which turned out to be precisely the right credential for the work he intended to do. He was not trying to fight the DEA in the courts, or protest in the streets, or write polemics about the injustice of psychedelic scheduling. He was going to do something considerably slower, more expensive, and more strategically sophisticated. He was going to get FDA approval for MDMA, assisted psychotherapy, by running the clinical trials the agency required, meeting every methodological standard, generating the peer-reviewed data that no regulatory body could legally ignore, and doing all of it within the existing system rather than outside it. The strategy was derided by many in the psychedelic community as impossibly naive. The FDA worked on timelines measured in decades. Clinical trials for a Schedule I substance required DEA approval at every step. The funding would have to come from private donors because no pharmaceutical company would touch a non-patentable compound with a Schedule I designation and a political history this radioactive. Every obstacle that could exist did exist, stacked in sequence, and Doblin's plan was to climb over each one individually, in order, without shortcuts. MAPS began filing for FDA approval to conduct Phase 1 safety studies in the early 1990s. The applications were denied, revised, resubmitted, denied again, revised again. The DEA created additional procedural barriers. Institutional review boards refused to approve protocols. Researchers willing to work with MAPS struggled to get the necessary federal licenses. The process was not merely slow, it was designed, at every level, to be prohibitive. What kept MAPS moving through all of it was a combination of Doblin's specific brand of relentless institutional persistence and the accumulating weight of an argument that kept getting stronger with every year that passed, without a legitimate therapeutic alternative for severe PTSD. The target population MAPS focused on was not accidental. PTSD had become, by the early 2000s, a crisis of documented and politically undeniable scale. The combination of the Gulf War, the Iraq War, and the Afghanistan War had produced a generation of veterans whose suffering was visible, whose treatment failure rates were documented, and whose demographic made them impossible to dismiss as counterculture casualties. Existing treatments, cognitive processing therapy, prolonged exposure therapy, antidepressants, helped some patients significantly and failed others completely. The treatment-resistant PTSD population was large, measurable, and dying. Suicide rates among veterans with treatment-resistant PTSD were a federal embarrassment. MAPS first FDA-approved. Phase 2 pilot study ran in the early 2000s, treating a small number of patients with chronic PTSD. People who had failed multiple conventional treatments and met the clinical definition of treatment-resistant. The protocol was careful, layered, and specifically designed to separate the drug's effects from the therapeutic relationship. Patients received MDMA in conjunction with structured psychotherapy sessions, with extensive preparation beforehand and integration sessions afterward. The drug was not the therapy. The drug was a tool that made the therapy possible. The results from the Phase 2 trials, accumulating across multiple sites and multiple years, were the kind of numbers that make clinical researchers stop and check their methodology twice because they seem too large to be real. Across the Phase 2 program, approximately 83% of participants who received MDMA-assisted therapy no longer met the diagnostic criteria for PTSD at the end of treatment. The control group, participants who received therapy with an inactive placebo, showed meaningful improvement too, around 25%, which reflected the genuine benefit of the therapeutic relationship alone. The gap between 25% and 83% was not a rounding error. It was a chasm. Veterans who had not slept without nightmares in 15 years were sleeping. Women who had been unable to speak about sexual assault without dissociating were speaking about it clearly, processing it, and reporting that the event felt finished rather than ongoing. First responders with chronic trauma from mass casualty events were returning to functional life. The MAPS researchers were not dealing with incremental improvements on existing benchmarks. They were watching treatment-resistant cases resolve at rates that had no precedent in the psychiatric literature. What made the results scientifically compelling was not just their magnitude, but their durability. Follow-up assessments conducted months and years after treatment consistently showed that the improvements held. This was critical because one of the standard criticisms of drug-assisted therapy, that any benefit was temporary, a chemical vacation from symptoms rather than a genuine resolution, was directly contradicted by the longitudinal data. Patients were not just feeling better while the drug was active. Something structural had changed in how their nervous systems related to the traumatic material. The mechanism was becoming clearer with each study. MDMA's simultaneous release of oxytocin and suppression of amygdala activity created what researchers began calling a therapeutic window, a specific neurological state in which traumatic memories could be accessed and processed without triggering the full threat response that normally made that processing impossible. The window lasted 3 to 5 hours, exactly the duration of the drug's primary effects. It was, in the most literal pharmacological sense, a door that MDMA opened and that closed again when the drug wore off, except that the therapeutic work done while the door was open didn't require the door to stay open. The changes it enabled were self-sustaining. Phase 2 results were submitted, published and reviewed by the FDA in 2017. The agency's response was the strongest possible validation short of full approval. MAPS was granted Breakthrough Therapy designation for MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD. This designation, reserved for treatments that show substantial improvement over existing options for serious conditions, unlocked intensive FDA guidance, faster review processes, and a level of institutional legitimacy that no psychedelic treatment had ever previously achieved. For the therapeutic community that had been operating underground since 1988, it was the equivalent of sunlight after 3 decades of darkness. Phase 3 trials began enrolling patients across multiple sites in the United States, Canada, and Israel. The scale was unprecedented for psychedelic research. Over 1,000 participants across sites that included academic medical centers, VA hospitals, and private research institutions. MAPS was no longer a fringe non-profit running studies on the margins of acceptability. It was running the most comprehensive psychedelic drug trial in the history of medicine, with FDA backing at institutions whose names carried the full weight of mainstream scientific credibility. Doblin had spent 30 years climbing obstacles in sequence, The summit was visible. What none of them fully anticipated was what would happen when they finally reached it. While MAPS was conducting its methodical, decade-long march through FDA bureaucracy, the culture that MDMA had created on the outside was following a completely different trajectory. Faster, louder, more financially enormous, and ultimately more self-destructive than anyone in the early Hacienda days could have predicted. Rave culture had gone corporate, and the process of going corporate had, with exquisite irony, made it simultaneously more visible and more dangerous than it had ever been underground. By the late 1990s, the small illegal gatherings in British fields and American warehouses had mutated into something unrecognizable from their origins. Promoters with real money had recognized that tens of thousands of people willing to pay for a single night's experience represented an extraordinary business opportunity. Events grew. The Electric Daisy Carnival, which began as a small underground gathering in Los Angeles in 1993, was drawing 50,000 attendees by the early 2000s. The Ultra Music Festival in Miami, founded in 1999, became an international brand within a decade. In Britain, superclubs like Cream in Liverpool and Gatecrasher in Sheffield were hosting thousands of people every weekend in legitimate licensed venues, booking the world's most famous DJs for fees that would have seemed hallucinatory to the original rave organisers. The music had changed with the money. Electronic dance music had fragmented into dozens of subgenres: trance, drum and bass, garage, progressive house, speed garage, each with its own crowd, its own drug preferences, its own aesthetic. The unified euphoric energy of the second summer of love had dispersed into a marketplace of experiences. Some of what emerged was genuinely extraordinary music. Some of it was algorithmically optimized product designed to produce the maximum emotional response in the minimum time, engineered specifically for a crowd that was, significantly, still using MDMA in enormous quantities. The drug supply was the darkest part of the story, and it was getting darker every year. The criminal networks that had taken over distribution after scheduling had, by the mid-1990s, discovered something economically rational and medically catastrophic. MDMA was expensive to produce, and many of the people buying ecstasy pills couldn't reliably distinguish pure MDMA from a tablet containing something cheaper. Methamphetamine cost less to produce, and produced an effect superficially similar enough that casual users often didn't notice the difference until they were already dependent. PMA, pramethoxyamphetamine, was cheaper still and had a dangerously narrow margin between a recreational dose and a lethal one. Pills containing PMA began appearing in European clubs in the mid-1990s, and the deaths that followed were misattributed to MDMA because the pills were sold as ecstasy. Testing services that could have addressed this problem were actively obstructed. Organizations offering pill testing at events, chemical analysis that could tell a user whether their tablet contained what it claimed to contain, were treated by British and American authorities as facilitators of drug use rather than as harm reduction services. Venues that allowed testing risked losing their licenses. The logic of prohibition, applied consistently, meant that the most effective tool available for preventing adulteration deaths was illegal to provide in the places where it was most needed. The Rave Act in the United States, passed in 2003 after multiple failed attempts under different names, formalized this approach into federal law. The legislation, formerly the Reducing Americans' Vulnerability to Ecstasy Act, a backronym so laboured it deserved its own warning label, made venue owners and event promoters criminally liable for drug use that occurred at their events if they could be shown to have had knowledge of it or taken insufficient steps to prevent it. The practical effect was immediate and sweeping. Promoters stopped booking harm reduction organisations. Venues banned water distribution. Event security began confiscating items associated with drug use, including, in some documented cases, earplugs, which had been deemed suspicious on the grounds that people who wanted to protect their hearing were probably planning to stay at the event longer than sober people would. The deaths at large events continued regardless. At the Electric Daisy Carnival in Los Angeles in 2010, a 15-year-old girl died from what was reported as an ecstasy overdose. The death occurred in a venue that had sold tickets to a minor in a crowd so large that security was effectively non-existent in significant portions of the space, where no medical services were prominently available and no harm reduction organization had been permitted to operate. The city of Los Angeles responded by banning the event entirely. The event moved to Las Vegas, grew larger, and continued. The cultural contradictions embedded in this moment were almost too large to process. Legal venues were hosting events that everyone, promoters, venue owners, local authorities, attendees, understood involved widespread drug use, while simultaneously maintaining a legal fiction of non-involvement that prevented any safety measures from being implemented. The system had arrived at an arrangement that maximized both profit and danger while providing perfect institutional deniability for everyone involved except the people dying. At the same time, the music culture itself was fracturing under the weight of its own commercialization. The early rave scene had carried a genuine utopianism. The plur philosophy, peace, love, unity, respect, was corny but sincere, a direct product of the communal emotional openness that MDMA produced in groups. Commercial festival culture retained the aesthetic vocabulary of that utopianism while hollowing out its content. The drugs were still there. The genuine connection between people had been substantially replaced by the performance of connection, Instagram documented, branded, sponsored. The irony was structural and total. MDMA's specific effect, the dissolution of social barriers, the feeling of authentic connection with strangers, had built a culture. That culture had been commodified. The commodification had attracted exactly the profit motive and institutional attention that the original underground had been designed to escape. And the process of commercialization had, paradoxically, made the drug use less safe, less informed, and less intentional than it had been in the illegal warehouse events of 1988. Underground veterans who had been there from the beginning watched the transformation with a particular kind of grief. The hacienda itself had closed in 1997, unable to manage the violence and drug dealing that commercial success had attracted. The original Shoom Night had lasted only a few years before the crowd that had discovered something genuine was replaced by a crowd that had come looking for the thing the first crowd had found. You cannot mass-produce a genuine experience. You can only mass-produce its symptoms. By 2005, the first generation of heavy ecstasy users from the late 1980s were entering their late 30s and early 40s. Some of them were fine. Some of them carried the specific cognitive signature of years of heavy serotonin system stress, difficulty with emotional regulation, memory gaps, a flatness of effect that their doctors were only beginning to recognize as a long-term pattern. The research on long-term outcomes remained contested, complicated by the adulteration problem. Nobody could be certain what those users had actually been taking across those years, but the clinical picture was not uniformly reassuring. The rave era was ending not with a single dramatic shutdown, but with a slow dispersal. The culture absorbed into the mainstream festival industry, the drugs absorbed into the general recreational market, the original community scattered across the ordinary trajectories of adult life. What it left behind was a music genre that now generated billions of dollars annually, a drug that was simultaneously more widely used and more poorly understood than at any previous point in its history, and a research program in downtown offices that was, very quietly, about to submit the most important drug application the FDA had seen in decades. The Phase 3 trial results that MAPS submitted to the FDA in 2023 represented something genuinely without precedent. Over 200 participants across 15 sites in the United States, Canada, and Israel. Rigorous methodology, independent monitoring, pre-registered outcomes. The primary result, 71% of participants who received MDMA-assisted therapy no longer met PTSD diagnostic criteria after treatment, compared to 48% in the placebo group. Secondary measures, functional impairment, quality of life, symptom severity, all moved in the same direction with statistical significance. 37 years after Rick Doblin had founded MAPS in direct response to the DEA's scheduling decision, the application package arrived at the FDA's offices in Silver Spring, Maryland, and the agency had 1 year to respond. The psychedelic research community, the therapeutic community, the veterans advocacy organizations, and the harm reduction world watched the review process with an attention that bordered on collective breath-holding. The breakthrough therapy designation that the FDA had granted in 2017 had raised expectations to a level that made the waiting almost physically uncomfortable. Researchers who had spent careers building this case were, for the first time, close enough to smell the finish line. What arrived in August 2024 was not an approval. It was a complete response letter, the FDA's formal mechanism for declining an application without permanently closing the door. The agency's concerns were specific and, to the research community, deeply frustrating. The first was a methodological issue that had been discussed for years as an inherent challenge of psychedelic drug trials, the blinding problem. MDMA produces effects so distinctive that participants almost always know whether they received the active drug or the placebo, which means the trial cannot be truly double-blind in the conventional sense. The FDA's advisory committee had voted narrowly that the efficacy data was not sufficient given this limitation. The second concern was more pointed and considerably more damaging to MAPS specifically. During the FDA review process, allegations had emerged about conduct during the trials, reports of boundary violations between therapists and participants at certain sites, inadequate monitoring of the therapeutic relationship, and questions about whether the specific dynamics of MDMA-assisted therapy, which involved extended intimate sessions in which patients were in vulnerable states, had been properly safeguarded. These allegations did not implicate the drug. They implicated the therapy delivery system built around it. The FDA's letter distinguished carefully between these two things, but the distinction was lost in most media coverage. The rejection landed in the research community like a physical blow. Jennifer Mitchell, the lead investigator on the Phase 3 trials, said publicly that she was devastated. Veterans organizations that had been preparing for the possibility of an approved treatment for their most treatment-resistant members expressed anger that mixed grief with something close to despair. The people who had been in those trials, who had experienced the therapeutic window firsthand, who had emerged from treatment changed in ways that years of conventional therapy had failed to produce, processed the news with a particular kind of bitterness reserved for bureaucratic decisions made about your body by people who have never inhabited it. Doblin, characteristically, did not treat it as a defeat. MAPS announced almost immediately that it would address the FDA's concerns and resubmit. The blinding problem was not unique to MDMA. It existed for any psychoactive compound in clinical trials and had been extensively discussed in the scientific literature. Solutions existed. More rigorous expectancy controls, active placebo conditions using low-dose psychoactives, expanded outcome measures that could detect effects independent of participant expectancy. The conduct allegations were a more serious problem, requiring protocol revisions, enhanced therapist training, and monitoring systems that had not been sufficiently robust in the original trials. None of these problems were unfixable. They were expensive, time-consuming, and deeply discouraging, but not unfixable. What happened simultaneously in Australia gave the global research community its most significant foothold. In February 2023, the Therapeutic Goods Administration, Australia's equivalent of the FDA, approved MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD, making Australia the first country in the world to formally legalise the treatment. The approval came with strict conditions: specially trained therapists, authorised treatment centres, comprehensive patient monitoring. But it was real. Patients in Australia were receiving legal, medically supervised MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD while the FDA was still deliberating. The global experiment that Doblin had been designing for nearly 4 decades was running somewhere, producing real-world data, building the evidence base that would eventually be impossible to ignore. The political landscape in the United States was shifting in ways that made simple prediction impossible. Several states had passed or were considering legislation to create therapeutic frameworks for psychedelic substances. Oregon had legalized psilocybin therapy in 2020. Colorado followed in 2022. Neither state had moved on MDMA specifically, but the trajectory was visible. The bipartisan support for psychedelic-assisted therapy for veterans, rare political common ground in an era defined by its absence, continued to generate congressional interest. The Department of Veterans Affairs had begun its own preliminary studies. The Special Operations Community, dealing with catastrophic rates of PTSD and suicide among its members, was openly advocating for expanded access. Alexander Shulgin had died in 2014, at 88, in the same house in Lafayette where he had built his backyard laboratory. His notebooks and compound library were preserved by his family and collaborators, an archive of the most unusual private pharmacological research in American history. Leo Zeff had died in 1988, the same year the DEA made MDMA's Schedule I status permanent. He did not live to see either the collapse of the therapeutic community he had built or its eventual resurrection. Anton Kurlish, who had synthesized the molecule on Christmas Eve in 1912 while trying to help Merck beat a competitor's blood-clotting patent, had been dead for over a century. The molecule they had each touched in their different ways and different eras was still moving. It was in clinical trials in a dozen countries. It was in the bodies of hundreds of thousands of recreational users every weekend, most of them taking something of uncertain composition bought from someone they barely knew. It was in the memories of a generation of ravers who had found something real in warehouse fields in 1988 and spent the rest of their lives occasionally wondering if they would ever feel it again. It was in the case files of therapists who had worked with it illegally for years and kept their notes because they believed, with a certainty built from direct observation, that the notes would eventually matter. The question that MDMA's history keeps returning to, the question underneath all the politics, the panic, the science, the culture, the legislation and the grief, is a simple one. What do you do with a molecule that genuinely helps people process the worst experiences of their lives, that also genuinely creates risks when used without care, that has been systematically misrepresented by both its advocates and its opponents, that has been shaped by every social force that touched it into something almost unrecognizable from its original form? The honest answer, in 2024, is that nobody has fully solved this. Not the FDA, not MAPS, not the DEA, not the therapists who used it on couches in the 1980s, or the promoters who built billion-dollar festivals around it in the 2000s. The molecule is more complex than any single narrative about it, more complex than miracle cure, more complex than dangerous party drug, more complex than either the billboard image of Leah Betts or the Phase 3 trial data in MAPS's submission package. What is clear is that the story is not finished. A molecule invented by accident in 1912, forgotten for 60 years, resurrected by a backyard chemist, spread by a retired therapist, rebranded by a Texas entrepreneur, banned by a government, danced to by 20 million people, cited in a fraudulent study, defended by a non-profit for 4 decades, approved in Australia, rejected in America, and still, in laboratory freezers, in clinical protocols, in the slowly evolving regulatory frameworks of a dozen countries, waiting for the world to figure out what to do with it. It has been waiting before. It is patient. And if the last 112 years have demonstrated anything at all, it is that this particular molecule does not stay buried.